Now, before I begin, or to ask you a question, I should say, by a show of hands, how many of you have ever seen addition when it comes to your checking account? Numbers going up in your checking account? Okay, hands down. How many of you have seen subtraction in your checking account? Hello? How many of you have ever seen multiplication in your checking account? Not a whole lot of hands going up. How many of you would love to see multiplication in your checking accounts? A lot more hands going up there. Now, in Luke chapter 9, which is the gospel text for this morning, there are two principles of multiplication that we need to put into practice when it comes to God's math. And as stewards, we need to understand the principle that we need to give. But you know what? We say, Lord, I do give. And God says, no, that's returning. The tithe that belongs to God.
Returning?
You see, we're not giving.
We're not giving, we're returning?
We're actually returning.
Indeed. Because Malachi 3 says, return to me, and I will return to you, says the Lord of hosts. But you say, how shall we return? Will man rob God? Yet you are robbing me. But you say, how have we robbed you? In your tithes and contributions. Bring the full tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and thereby put me to the test, says the Lord God of hosts. If I will not open the windows of heaven for you and pour down for you a blessing until there is no more need. The whole idea of robbing God seems inconceivable, right? Now, of course, Israel denied the charge, but then God explained that they were robbing him by bringing only part of their tithes and offerings to the temple. And in their tight-fisted, self-centered state, they were cheating God. They were failing to bring him the whole tithe and the required offerings to the temple. Now, the law back then, not today, but the law back then mandated that a tithe, a tenth, of the produce of the land back then be given to the Lord. And so when the people held back portions of the tithes and the offerings for themselves, they were breaking the law. And in effect, they were robbing God. They were taking what belonged to God and they were using it for themselves. Now, as I said, that was back then, not today. You see, we are not under that Old Testament law today. And we are not required to give a tenth as Israel was. However, it's still possible that we rob God when we don't give him what he's owed. And what is he owed? Good question. Our wholehearted love, trust, obedience, service, and worship. Everything we have comes from God. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, he tells us. So we rob God when we are stingy with our time, keeping it mostly for ourselves, and neglecting to pray, worship, and serve and attend to the needs of other people. You see, God deserves nothing less than the absolute best of our time, attention, obedience, devotion, and resources. Our wallets are only a part of the equation because, in essence, we owe God our very lives. Our willingness to express the Lord's ownership of our lives through open-hearted, cheerful giving is the minimum that we can do for God. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For the measure you use, it will be measured back to you, says God. That's what returning to God all means. What do you say? We get back to the sermon.
And here are the two principles of God's multiplication. Number one is this: it has to be blessed before it can multiply. Now think about this. What if they had taken the fish and the loaves and given it away without Jesus blessing it? It probably never would have multiplied. The reason it multiplied was because Jesus blessed it. With the blessing of Jesus, it can multiply. Nothing is impossible with God. Luke 1:37. Paul writes, I can do all things through God who strengthens me. And the second principle of God's multiplication is this: it has to be given away to be multiplied.